Okay. So we were thinking about chapter 3 of the Song of Songs. I did the beginning of the first few verses. And just to give sort of a 60-second recap, we're sort of beginning, I guess we would call it the third phase, the third song, the third part. The first part, we saw that the woman was seeking her beloved. He was far less enthusiastic than she was. She asks him, "Where are you?" He doesn't really say. She is lovesick. He's willing to compliment her, not much more than that. That's song 1 till the middle of chapter 2. Middle of chapter 2, we start the second part. The tables turn. He is leaping over the hills coming for her. She, not that, she says, well, come back later, come back in the afternoon. He's much more anxious than her, or excited about this meeting. The problem was, we read at the end of the end of the second song, is that he doesn't come back, and she's searching for him. And then there was some sort of meeting. She found him. I'm not going to let him go. She found him. What does that mean? We don't know exactly. Did they move in together? Is it something just in her mind? She thinks she feels connected. We don't know. That's the past. Now we're going to start what seems to be the third part of the song. And the third part of the song, depending how you count it, again, there's so many ways of dividing this. What is almost certainly sure that the division of the chapters is just a distraction. But in any case, we're assuming now it seems like there's a wedding scene. And the wedding scene is going to last 2.5 chapters. In other words, it mentions the wedding in the end of chapter 3. And then there's some praises, 2 chapters of praises, but we're still at the feast. So let's assume the wedding is starting now, and the wedding is going to last part of the wedding, or even the celebration post-wedding, that takes up some time. So now they're meeting. Now there's the wedding. Okay. So now we have to describe what exactly is happening at this wedding. Who exactly is getting married? And again, I'm giving you one interpretation, but other people, it's not even exactly sure if the king is the beloved. But we're going to assume, again, what we're going to assume now, this is the wedding of the people we were talking about up till this point. We have the young woman who's anonymous. We don't know exactly who she is. We assume, and the groom is King Solomon, even though not always does he appear as a king, but certainly at the wedding he appears as a king. And what you're going to see in these verses is you see a very significant contrast in how they come to the wedding. So you have, here comes the bride, and then you have, here comes the groom. So the bride comes. Where does she come from? She comes from the desert. Very strange place to come from. Nobody lives in the desert. The bride is coming from the desert. Nobody knows exactly who she is. The question is, Mizot, who is this emerging? So we'll show you the verses in a minute. She is alone. She doesn't have a history. She doesn't have friends. She appears to be alone. Then after a verse or two, the focus turns to the king, which we assume is the groom, which we know is the groom. It says his wedding day. So he's the groom. And then the contrast between the groom and the bride, the groom, they're surrounded by people. You'll see the verses that highlight there are people there. There's a palace, there's beauty, there's riches, there's wealth, there's people, both men and women. There's an excitement. And it seems like the contrast here is this marriage is heading for failure because they're really from different cultures. She's from the desert. She's not impressed by the palace. She's not impressed with the fact that the king has a secret service of 60 guards around his bed. For her, it's a distraction. But the king, you can't live without it if you're a king. So I think that part of the verses are contrasting the difference between these two people is going to help explain why, even though they love each other, very soon after the wedding, in chapter, I believe it's 5, I may be wrong, there's going to be a major crisis. But the roots of the crisis begin already because of the differences in their personality. So this seems to be what's going on over here. So I'm going to share the verses. We're going to look at middle of chapter 3, and we're going to look at verse 6. Verse 6. Just because the chapter begins Just because the chapter begins, it's the middle of a chapter, doesn't mean it's not a new beginning. Verse 6, here you have, it doesn't say wedding in verse 6. The first time it says wedding is in verse 11. But we assume that verse 11 is already giving us information about verse 6. We assume that. So let's see what's going on over here. Who is this coming up from the desert? Like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense of all the powder of the peddler. So this is, who is this? But it's feminine. Mi zot. Zot is feminine. And olah, emerging, coming up, is feminine. Not ole, but olah. So there's a woman coming up from the desert. But what do we know? We know she's alone. We know nobody really knows who she is, because then they would say who it is, right? If they're asking, if the narrator is asking, who is this emerging from the desert? It's almost like a surprise. This is the bride. This is the bride of the king. We would expect the bride to be someone that recognizable or someone noble. Here, this is somebody almost like an outsider. In any case, she is perfumed. We assume perfumed is for the special occasion, that is the wedding. So we have myrrh, more in Hebrew, levona, frankincense, and all the powder of the peddler, meaning she had all types of perfumes. And why smoke? Why is smoke? Well, like columns of smoke, but in those days, the smoke and the perfume were interrelated, because the way you would perfume is either put the perfume into oil and cook the oil, and then the oil would absorb the smell, and then you would put the oil on your skin, or you would just you would make a fire and burn the species that you're putting into the mix, and that would make a smell like the Torah, like the incense in the temple, and that was very common. So if you're going with the perfume, you probably have a coal and a fire and smoke coming up, and that's the reference of she's very perfumed and she's emerging from the desert, and we assume that she's coming to the wedding, even though it doesn't say so explicitly. So we have one verse about the bride. Now let's look at the groom. And the groom's the king. So we need many verses to describe the king's, how do I say this? The king's glory and the king's greatness. So behold, now if you want humor, this is humor. Dr. Ken wanted humor. Verse 5, contrast. You want to explain, just setting this up. Who is verse 7, behold the litter of Solomon, the bed of Solomon. 60 mighty men are around it, of the mighty men of Israel. You're trying to get married, but there's 60 people between you and your groom. How is this marriage going to work? Okay, it's just the scene is funny. The contrast between who is this? We don't even know who she is, but she's certainly alone. Just one individual. It's in this. It's in the singular. Mizot olah. Who is this coming up? It's singular. And here you have Solomon with 60 men, but now he's got 60 men. Let's see, what are these men doing there? They all hold the sword, skilled in warfare, each one with his sword on his thigh, because of fear at night. This is also humor, I think. Okay, you have the king. Who's more afraid, the king or the woman coming up from the desert? You would expect the woman from the desert, she's alone, she should be afraid. The king, they still got security guard. No, they're all standing with swords, 60 men, they're all afraid. Right? Because being afraid is a psychological state of mind. It's not so much objective reality. Maybe the king is more threatened than the girl coming up alone in the desert. So again, I'm not an expert on these subtleties, but it seems to me that there's at least some mocking of the king going on here, at least in the basic reading. Of course, in the way we read it, that's about God. Everything's going to be changed. And we'll read about who the mighty men and what is the war and what are we afraid of. All this is interpreted by Rashi, and some of it is interpreted by the Kabbalah. In any case,
Rabbi,
now, go ahead.
This is in the bedtime Shema, right?
Yeah, we say this verse in the bedtime Shema. Correct. These verses, verse 7 and 8. Correct.
And so, do you know what it represents when we say why we say it at night?
We assume that it's evoking the protection, right? We assume that it's evoking the protection. But once we get to, I don't know the answer to your question. Let's read at least the Rashi and the Kabbalistic interpretation, and then we could start guessing. But the answer is I don't know the answer to your question of why we say it. But you're absolutely right. Before we go to bed in the nighttime Shema, after the Shema we read many verses. Some of them is amongst them is verse 7 and 8. Okay, we're not done yet. King Solomon made himself a palanquin, I think that's the word, a pirion, of trees of Lebanon. Okay, so he's making himself this is like a chuppah, right? So you have a chuppah. He doesn't just make a chuppah like cloth, like you have seen, but he made it out of the trees of Lebanon. The trees of Lebanon were considered the most beautiful and strong and tall trees in the Middle East. But we're not done. 10. Its pillars he made of silver, its couch of gold, its curtain of purple, its interior, now listen to this verse, its interior inlaid with love from the daughters of Jerusalem. I have no idea what this verse means, at least the end, but it seems like it is possible that this woman is not even the only woman there. There are other women there, other girls there, other daughters of Jerusalem. Now we know that King Solomon had 1,000 wives, okay? So that also has to fit in. There's no such thing as marrying the king and being alone. It doesn't work that way with the king. So now King Solomon. In the olden days, in this week's parsha, we didn't read it yesterday, but in other words, we didn't get to that part. But in this week's parsha, there's three commandments about a king. First, he can't have too many horses. Second, he can't have too many wives. Third, he can't have too much money. What does that mean in simple English? Too much horses, and the army can't be too powerful. The horses was the army. You can't have too many tanks. Your nuclear arsenal cannot be too great. And too many wives basically says you can't have that big of an advanced foreign policy, because in the ancient world, a good king has to marry everybody, because when you marry other kings, that's how you make peace. And if you're King Solomon and you want to have a kingdom and you want to be connected to all the various powers in the world, you basically marry 1,000 wives. That means you have 1,000 people who are your allies. That's the way it was in the ancient world. There's no secret. So, but the reality is that this girl who's coming to the wedding, she thinks she's coming to a wedding. Meanwhile, first of all, she's got 60 men around King Solomon. Number two, they finally go into the chuppah and its interior inlaid with love from the daughters of Jerusalem. I have no idea what that means, but it means that she's not the only one there. Okay, that's what we're going to focus on today. But of course, verse 11 we have to read because this is the highlight, and we're going to discuss verse 11 tomorrow, next time. But verse 11 reads, "Go out, O daughters of Zion, and gaze upon King Solomon, upon the crown which his mother crowned him on the day of his nuptials and on the day of the joy of his heart." In other words, it's a wedding. Everybody, all the daughters of Zion are coming to see Solomon. What are they looking at specifically? Looking at the crown that his mother made for him, which is something we mentioned earlier. The mother, both beginning of the chapter and third chapter, we have the theme of the mother. I don't want to repeat that again, unless somebody wants me to specifically. But here the key is, the difficulty with this, again, is if you say, King Solomon seems so powerful. They say, where does his power come from? It comes from his mother. What are they looking at? His crown. His crown is a symbol of his power. Where does that come from? His mother. And you could say on a simple level, it's referring to the fact that King Solomon's mother actually made him the king, because Bathsheba went to King David and influenced King David to make him the king. So really his power does come from his mother. There are many other ways to read this. All I'm trying to say is come back next time, because the big problem is if you're going to refer this to Hashem, who's Hashem's mother? Right? We know other faiths that think that God has a mother, but we don't think so. So this becomes something we have to deal with, and we're going to deal with it. But that's just a teaser and a trailer to come back next time. But we have plenty to deal with verse 7, figuring out who the bride is, and also who are the people. What is the bed of Solomon? Who's guarding the bed of Solomon? What do you need 60 people? What are they afraid of? What's the fear of night, etc., etc. So this is our work cut out for us. In the meantime, any comments, questions, even jokes, please join. Please share. Otherwise, we continue. Chaim. Okay, so we start unpacking. To unpack, we're going to look at Rashi. Remember, Rashi is reading the historic perspective. So he wants to find a period of history when the Jews are emerging from the desert and the king is coming to marriage between the king and the bride, between the groom and the bride. So when you say desert in the historical perspective, you're obviously going to think of the time that the Jewish people were in the desert. Very easy. So the whole period of the desert is sort of the Jewish people coming to the wedding with God. I want to say something with the wedding. With the wedding, there's different interpretations because we're going to be on the wedding for a little bit, and even post-wedding, we have to understand what the wedding is. So the wedding, we think of a wedding as a one-time event. You show up to the wedding, and you get everything done. You need everything you need to be done in one day, or in one half a day. But in biblical times, the wedding is much more complicated affair. First of all, there's the betrothal and the wedding that happens 12 months apart. Today, we unite both those ceremonies under the chuppah. The giving of the ring is the betrothal. And later, going either under the chuppah or going into a secluded room is called nisuin, is the marriage. And the blessings that we say, the 7 blessings, the Sheva brachot, are part of the second half of the marriage. We combine, even in Talmudic times, these two ceremonies were done 12 months apart. We combine them into one half hour. But there's no reason to assume that the wedding is a one-time event. Wedding is a process. And therefore, when you read the commentators, what is the wedding? You're going to have at least 3 possibilities, or it's interchangeable perhaps there are other interpretations, but you're going to have either Sinai or building the tabernacle, the home for God, the Mishkan, which is again the home where the God and the Jewish people come in. They go into bed together, so to speak. As you see the bed, we'll discuss the bed. But others say that it refers that's the beginning of the process. The ultimate marriage happens on the day that King Solomon concluded the building of the temple in Jerusalem. And that's what the Mishnah does. The Mishnah on verse 11, that says, B'yom Simchat Libo, says the day of his nuptials is the giving of the Torah. The day of the joy of his heart, that's the day of the building of the temple. In other words, the way we could either to simplify it, there's a process of bringing the bride and groom together. It begins at Sinai. God comes down onto the mountain. The Jewish people come to the mountain. Begins at Sinai, but it doesn't conclude until either the temple, the portable temple, the tabernacle, or ultimately the temple in Jerusalem. So I just want to say something about that marriage because there are going to be different interpretations, and these concepts we're going to be repeating it. But the theme of marriage, the theme of the intimacy between God and the Jewish people, happens in these 3 settings, and collectively you can refer to them as the wedding. Now, the different rabbis, some highlight the Torah, some highlight, and others the giving of a Torah, some highlight the tabernacle, like Rashi does, as you will see, but others highlight the temple, which is the same theme as the tabernacle. The tabernacle was in a temporary way, and the Temple of Solomon, it was a permanent way. But since this verse says Solomon, so it's nice to say that it's also referring to the times of Solomon, which is the temple, which would be the culmination of all of this. So I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to share the Rashi, okay? We got to deal with the Rashis here. Rashi's commentary. Who is this coming up from the desert? When I was traveling through the desert, and a pillar of fire and cloud were going before me, and killing the snakes and scorpions, and burning the thorns and thistles to make a straight road, and the cloud of the smoke were ascending, the nations saw them and were astounded by my greatness. And they said, who is this? i.e., how great is this one coming up from the desert, etc. Says Rashi, what is the pillars of smoke? Right? I said it's connected to the perfumes. Rashi says, no. You remember the verse in Exodus. Verse in Exodus says that when the Jewish people traveled to the desert, there was a cloud of glory during the day and a pillar of smoke, a pillar of fire at night that cleared the path and led the way for the Jewish people as they traveled to the desert. And that's the groom, that's the bride coming to her wedding. And then the other people, the surrounding, the spectators, which here are the nations of the world, say, who is this coming from the desert? Not a who as in a question of who this is, but how great is she? It's wondering, how great is her quality that all these miracles are performed on her behalf. So that's Rashi, very easy. Desert equals what? Desert equals the Jewish people traveling through the desert. Now, columns of smoke, Rashi addresses the Hebrew word timrot. Timrot is columns. Rashi explains what the etymology of the root, which is very cute. Timrot, tall and erect as a palm tree. Tamar is a palm tree, but a palm tree is tall and erect. Even you go land in Israel, land in Ben Gurion Airport today. I don't know about today, the new airport, but I don't remember the new. I don't think I was at the new airport, unfortunately. But in the old airport, you get off the plane, all you see is the palm trees. They're tall. That's the first thing you see. So the tall palm trees. Timrot, Tamar is a palm tree. Timrot is a pillar of smoke. Why is Timrot a pillar of smoke? What is the etymology? What's the root of the word? Rashi says that Timrot is like going up, ascending like a palm tree. That was just interesting if you're into the language. In any case, perfumed with myrrh, more. I don't know how you say it in English. Rashi says, what does it mean we had perfumes? The cloud of incense which would rise straight up from the inner altar. The Jewish people, I mentioned this before, the Jewish people would in the temple, they would bring incense as part of the service of the temple. Of those incense, by the way, in the temple, there were 11 ingredients that went into the incense. The Torah only mentions 4. The rest are passed on from Moshe at Sinai. The first is more. In the Torah, God tells Moshe, take for you spices, B'samim rosh. The first one is mar. More is mir. So in other words, the verse alludes to the first ingredient within the incense that the Jewish people would offer in the desert. So here we have all these visions coming together. The Jewish people traveling through the desert with pillars of smoke. That's the pillar of fire that traveled before them. And the Jewish people are perfumed, beautified with the spices. What are the spices? The spices is the incense that they offer to God. The peddler, a spice merchant who sells all types of spices. Peddler, usually we think of selling anything, but in this context, the peddler is the merchant who peddles specifically in spices, in other words, perfumes. So basically, the perfume peddler. And again, the Hasidic interpretation is going to give us a little bit more indication of what does it mean, all the types of perfumes. And there's the word, Rashi says, powder, Hebrew, avkat, since they crush it and pound it, it is as fine as dust. So the word avkat is dust of the peddler. Dust of the peddler means the perfume that is crushed like dust. Okay, that's the woman. Let's think about the groom. Who's the groom? So we have behold the litter of Solomon, the bed of Solomon, 60 mighty men. What's the bed of Solomon? What is a bed? So Rashi says the bed is the tent of meeting and the ark, which they carried in the desert. A bed is a place of unity, a place of intimacy. Where's the intimacy between God and the Jewish people? The temple, more specifically, the ark. So the ark is the bed of Solomon. Solomon in this context is God, is the groom, is God. Now, why does God need 60 mighty men? So the answer is, this refers to the 600,000 Jews who camped around the desert. Why 60? So 60 mighty men are around it. 60 myriad surrounded it. What is myriad? In English, it means many. But in ancient English, in other words, the one definition is that a myriad is 10,000. Because in Hebrew, the way it works is you have 1, you have 10, you have 100, you have 1,000, and then there's a word rebo, 10,000. So in the Torah, when you want to say there's 600,000 people, you say there's 60, 10,000. The 60 myriad. That's the way it works in the Torah. So in this, so Rashi is explaining that when you say you have the bed of Solomon, which is the tent of meeting, bed of Solomon, which is the ark, surrounded by 60 men of Israel, you're referring to the Jewish people that camped around the tent of meeting, because that's how we know, that's how they traveled through the desert. What is the mighty men of Israel? Of those who go out to the army, in addition to those under 20 years of age and those over 60, right? The number 60 men, mighty men of Israel, the number 600,000 was specifically the people of draftable age who went to the army. That's the mighty men. Now, all of them hold swords, skilled in warfare, each one with his sword on his thigh because of the fear of night. What are they afraid of? What are the Jews afraid of? What's the war? What's the warfare? Says Rashi, skilled in warfare, the War of Torah. And similarly, the priests who surrounded it, who camp around the tabernacle, skilled in the order of their service. So we have here a security detail, skilled in warfare. What's warfare? So warfare is, the Talmud refers to the battle and the debates with Torah study as the warfare of Torah. So that's one possibility Rashi gives. The other is the priests who are skilled in their service. Okay, each one with his sword. If the war is the war of Torah, of debates, then what is your ammunition? These are the Masorah and the mnemonics by which they preserve the correct version of the oral law, and the Masorah, the traditional spelling and reading of the scriptures, lest it be forgotten. So the sword is our tools. The tools is what allows us remembering of the tradition and the Masorah, the precise spelling of the words of the Bible. That allows us to keep the tradition alive. What are they afraid of night? From the fear of the nights? Why do you have to hold on to your sword, hold on to the Masorah, hold on to the tradition? Because of the fear of night. What's the fear of night? Says Rashi, lest they forget it and troubles will befall them. And so scripture says, arm yourselves with the grain of Torah, lest he became angry and you perish on the way. In other words, the fear of night is the fear of the darkness that comes about because of the forgetfulness of the Torah. So that is Rashi, that's the historical perspective. We have a marriage, we have the Jewish people traveling through the desert, we have with the columns of smoke and the perfume, which refers to the fire that the Jewish people, leads the Jewish people through the desert. The perfumes is the incense that the Jewish people serve before God. And then you have God is coming onto the bed. That the bed of Solomon is the temple, or the ark specifically within the temple, within the portable temple, the tabernacle. We're surrounded by 60 men, means surrounded, 60 mighty men, means that the Jewish army at the time was 600,000 strong. 600,000 is 60 times 10,000. And they're armed in warfare, they're armed in the study of Torah. So that is the historic perspective from Rashi's perspective. And now we can all go home because this itself was interesting enough. But if you stick around for another few minutes, I'll give a little bit of a sprinkle of the Hasidic interpretation.
Rabbi, can I ask you a quick question? You mentioned that Solomon had 100 wives.
No, 1,000.
1,000 wives. Okay, I'm sorry, even more so. Okay, so
I don't want. That's a big mistake. That's a big difference.
That's the humor. But that's how does that reflect on how many weddings that did he have? That's the first question. And second is, how does it reflect on the interpretations?
So that's the short answer is it depends. And again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you a consistent interpretation throughout the story that is consistent with that is closest both to the. Okay, here's the problem. Let's start with the problem. The problem is that traditionally this book was studied the way Rashi studies it and the Medrash studies it. It was studied as the historical perspective and the Hasidic perspective. It was not necessarily traditionally studied as to understand what the actual story is. See what I'm saying? The first level of Pshat, has not been explored to its fullest by the sages. Some have. Malbim a little bit, Even Ezra a little bit, but the discussing of what is the simple meaning of the story was much less because it wasn't as interesting to the people studying it as the interpretation of what it means in the relationship with God. But nevertheless, recently in the last 100 years, there are people, both scholars, both Jewish, not Jewish, both secular and religious, who are more interested in what is a simple story. Okay? And now, therefore, there's an explosion of interpretations. And what I'm trying to do is try to give you as much as I can from collecting of what I understand from what people are saying about the simple interpretation, but at least somewhat consistent with level 2 and level 3 with the historic and the Hasidic. So now, if I were just telling you the simple story, I'm to show you the confusion because he had 1,000 wives. It's not even sure that this is the wedding between Solomon. The other scholars are saying that it's not even sure this is the wedding of Solomon and his beloved that we were talking about. Maybe this is a wedding that she's viewing a different wedding for one of the other 999 wives. You see what I'm saying? So it's vague. You're right. It's vague. We don't know for sure. At least if you knew nothing other than the simple reading, there's no indication for sure who the bride is. It doesn't. The narrator is saying the story. It's not in first person. Remember, the first chapter is first and second chapter is spoken in first person. There's first person narrator. Here we have third person narrator. Who's coming from the desert. So it shifts perspective. So again, I'm trying to be consistent with the sages and with the Kabbalistic. So I'm giving the interpretation that this is the wedding of the beloved that we've been talking about and King Solomon, but it's not at all clear in the simple meaning. If you want to talk, so I'm not sure if this helps or confuses, but you want to talk about, some people would say part of the tension, and this appears later in the book in chapter 6 and 7. part of the tension between God and the Jewish people is that, at least according to some interpretations, that the Jewish people want, the girl coming from the desert wants an exclusive relationship with King Solomon. King Solomon can't do it. Can't do it. If you're a king, you can't have an exclusive relationship. You can't be alone. You're always going to have security detail, and you're always going to have the inner part of your room is also going to be covered with the love of the daughters of Jerusalem. Whether it means literally, figuratively, you can't be alone with the king. It's an impossibility. Okay, what does it mean in the spiritual relationship with God? In some sense, God is the God of all the nations. The Jewish people want intimacy. And now in exile, which is after the wedding, after the honeymoon is over, and after the tension after the wedding, now it gets scary, because then this beloved woman believes that her husband is going looking for other wives. Maybe somebody else is better. Later you'll see, my husband went to look to go pick roses, which is obviously a euphemism, to maybe he'll find somebody better than me. Right? So the Jewish people, especially in exile, they have this sort of inner conflict, which they just want an exclusive relationship with God. It's not clear that God could have an exclusive relationship with us. It's not clear that he should. But
absolutely it shouldn't, because he's all powerful. And if we do try to understand, I mean, even historical interpretation, he doesn't have to be exclusive. We, on the other hand, can be.
However, we do believe that God's relationship with the Jewish people is unique, right? So even though you have 1,000 wives, but you have a unique relationship with the Jewish people, and that is she takes her time to realize that, right? So again, this is a very complicated relationship, not just in the simple level, but on the spiritual level as well. Okay, let's look a little bit at the Hasidic interpretation of the verse. Mi zoto lemina midbar. Who is this one that emerges? Who is the one emerging from the desert? Let's read the verses. Hide Rashi. Right. So we'll focus on verse 6. Who is this coming up from the desert, like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, of all the powders of the peddler? Okay, we'll focus on that. This is based on a discourse that Rabbi Shneur Zalman said that's actually printed in Megillas Esther, in the Scroll of Esther. How it got to the Scroll of Esther is another story, but that's where it's printed. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman's interpretation is, again, this is the relationship, this is the story of every Jewish soul and God, right? That's the third perspective. The third perspective is that it's not historic, not only historic, not exclusively historic, but every Jew in their relationship with God also has this moment of marriage, of intimacy with God, emerging from the desert. So when do we emerge from the desert? The answer is before every Shabbat and holiday. What is a desert? A desert is a place where which is inhospitable to human life. What is a spiritual desert? The spiritual desert is the place where there's no spiritual life, meaning no holiness. So the 6 days of the week, we are involved in mundane activities. Either we're going to work, or we're going to the field, or we're running errands, but we're not involved in holiness to the extent that we are on Shabbat. So if you think about when are we coming to the wedding of God? Right? We say Friday night, we say the beautiful song, the Kabbalistic song, L'cha dodi likrat kala. Come, my beloved, let's go greet the bride. Okay, what's happening here? What's happening is Friday afternoon, and the sages of the Talmud already, the Kabbalists in Tzfat reinstituted it, but the sages of the Talmud already would go out to the field and say, let's go meet the Shabbat bride. Okay, so what's happening here is Friday afternoon, collectively, the Jewish people as a whole, but also every individual Jew is emerging from the desert, emerging from the place where there's less holiness, which is inhospitable to holiness, and coming into Jerusalem, coming into the marriage of God. And that is something that happens every Friday and every holiday. And that's the wedding, and that's the desert. Okay. What do we see when we come from the desert? What do you see? If you're standing bird's eye view, you see an image emerging from the desert. What do you see? You see smoke. What does smoke represent? Timrot Ashan, pillars of smoke. What does the smoke represent? So the smoke, what is smoke? Smoke is when you burn something, and different substances produce different amount of smoke. Every fuel has a different amount of smoke. If you light a candle, there's not going to be any smoke. Why not? Because the substance that's being consumed is more refined. If it's more refined, there's no resistance, so to speak. And therefore, it becomes fuel, it becomes part of the fire, and it goes up, and there's not that much smoke. Meanwhile, if you put a piece of wood, especially one that's very wet, okay, so it's going to be hard to catch. But once it catches fire, there's resistance. If the substance that's being consumed resists, either because of moist or because it's coarse, then it's going to produce a lot of smoke. So when we are in the desert, what is our job? Our job is to produce smoke. What's producing smoke? We take the material, the physical world, which is naturally resistant to holiness, and it's our job to let it go up in smoke, ascend upward, heavenward, defying gravity, elevating it to the connection to God. So why is there so much smoke? There's smoke because it represents the resistance. The things we're trying to elevate are naturally not holy and not connected to God, and they resist. They don't want to give up their ego. They don't want to give up their sense of self. And that is our job, to create that smoke, to create that fire. But fire needs fuel. And fuel means you elevating this physical substance to become fuel, to fuel the fire, to raise it up to God. And that is the next phrase in the verse. Who is this emerging from the desert like pillars of smoke? Pillars of smoke is our mission statement while being in the desert. Okay, so that's the smoke. Now, what is the types of perfume we have? So we have two perfumes, mor and levona. Mor is here translated myrrh. I have no idea what that means. Frankincense, I'll be honest with you, I have no idea what frankincense is either. Dr. Ken wants a joke. The joke is someone comes to the rabbi. The woman comes to the rabbi with a piece of meat, and she says, "Well, there's one of the laws of kosher slaughter is that the certain parts of the animal has to be healthy. And if you slaughter the animal and you inspect the insides and you see there's a hole in the lung for example, then the animal is not kosher. So the woman brings a limb of the animal, part of the animal, to the rabbi to examine, and she says, "Is this a problem? Is this hole a problem that will disqualify this animal?" And he was an expert in Jewish law. He knew every book ever written on the subject. And he looks at this and he says, "If this is a lung, it's a problem. If it's a stomach, it's not a problem. If it's a foot, it's not a problem." He knew the law, but he didn't know the reality on the ground. That's the joke. So I'm saying is I have no idea. Last time I went to the perfume shop, I didn't ask for frankincense. I didn't ask for myrrh. So I don't know exactly what this means, but we're going to go by the Hebrew words. Mekuteret mor. She is perfumed with mor and livona. Mor ulivona. What does mor mean and what does livona mean? So livona is easy. Livona means white. The word livona, lavan, is white. Then you have mor. Mor is what? Anybody? Mor, mar. Mar is bitter. She is perfume. The Jew coming from the 6 days of the week, coming to Shabbat, is bitter and white. Is perfumed with bitter and white. So what does that mean? So bitter is the sense that there is really the theme, I think one of the overarching themes of at least this entire book, at least what we did till now, is that ironically, the fact that we're distant from God creates more of a stronger longing to connect to God. If we were always in Jerusalem, then we would not necessarily yearn for God as we do when we're distant. So the feeling of distance, the sadness of being apart, is actually the perfume which makes us more beautiful to God, our yearning to God. You have a very famous Chabad song, it's King David's song. There's a Chabad tune that ever taught the tune, Sama Lecha Nafshi. And Sama Lecha Nafshi is that my soul thirsts for you, like someone who's in a parched land thirsting for water. That's King David. And then the next verse says, so I yearn to see you in holiness. That's the conventional interpretation. Baal Shem Tov interprets this verse as follows. I wish that I would yearn for you in the holiness, when I'm in the holiness, as I yearn for you in the desert, right? Because King David was forced to run away from Jerusalem. He's escaping from his son. And then he realizes that he really misses Jerusalem. And he says, God, I yearn for you. I yearn for Jerusalem. I yearn to see you in Jerusalem like someone who's in a parched land, a desert and parched land without water. And then he gets to a deeper realization. He says, you know what? I wish that when I come back, B'Kodesh, when I come back and I'm in the holiness, I should maintain some of the yearning that I had through the desert. So that's the beauty that comes, the bitterness, because the woman was in the desert. That because throughout the 6 days we don't sense the connection to God that we sense on Shabbat. That produces a yearning that creates the love and yearning, and that's beautiful. But we're not depressed on Shabbat. We're joyous. That's the next word, livona. Livona is white. White is an expression of joy, the opposite of mourning, which is black. If you have the yearning, then when you come to the reunification, then the reunification is joyous. And in fact, the stronger the yearning was during the 6 days, the stronger the joy of the reunification is. If I didn't miss you when I come to meet you again, okay, I'm not that happy. But if I really missed you and I was bitter because of my distance from you, then now when we finally reunite, now the joy is great. So that is the two spices that the woman is perfumed with, according to Rabbi Shneur Zalman. And we have just one more issue to deal with is, what does it mean? All. What does it mean? All the powder of the peddler. Seems like there's all different types of perfumes. So we have the two main ones. Everybody is unique in other words, every soul has the more the bitterness and the joy that comes after the bitterness. And then all the power of the peddler refers to the fact that every person's emotional buildup is different. Every person's emotional relationship with God, no two people love or respect or are in awe of God the same. Everybody has their unique emotional makeup. And therefore, we don't define what the other spices are. We just say there's all the spices of the peddler, because there's a whole spectrum of emotions that the bride coming from the desert feels toward God. And that's the perfume. So we have the general feelings that are universal, and that is the bitterness of distance and the joy that comes as a result of the bitterness of distance at the reunion. But that's in general, that's generic to everybody. And then everybody has their own emotional relationship with God, and that is not described, but we say there's a whole spectrum of spices that is part of the perfume. So that is addressing the bride side. Now we want to talk a little bit about the groom side. What is the bed? What is the war? And here, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, this is actually not from Rabbi Shneur Zalman, it's from his grandson, it's Tzemach Tzedek. Here he basically says what Rashi says, but adds a little bit of interpretation and a few interesting details I thought were interesting. So we're going to go with Rashi and just add Kabbalistic spice to what Rashi said. But so far, this is what we covered: is the groom, is the bride emerging from the desert. Again, every Friday, every eve of the holiday, we're coming from the desert. We're coming to the 6 days, coming up with smoke, because that's what we have been doing. We've been smoking the place up. We've been lighting the physical substances and making them fuel that will go up to God. And in the process, there's smoke. Smoke is the byproduct of the resistance of the materialism when it does what's unnatural to it, which is become spiritual, which is exactly what we do during the 6 days. Okay, so just to add a few details to what we said about the groom. So the groom, we talked about the bed. What is the bed? Hinei mitato, what's the bed of Solomon? So we said the bed of Solomon, according to Rashi, right here we have verse 7, behold the litter of Solomon. The bed of Solomon is the tent of meeting and the ark. And we said that the warfare, the sword is the warfare of Torah. And that, of course, is going to stand also according to the Hasidic interpretation, but we're just going to add some spices and some details. So let's begin with what is the bed? What is a bed? A bed is a place of intimacy. What does Rashi say? What's a bed? A bed is Ohel Moed, the place of tent of meeting. But tent of meeting, Moed, the Hebrew words for Moed are the same letters, two of the same letters as da'at, which is knowledge. In other words, where is the place of intimacy that the Jew has? So the physical space was the tent of meeting where the Torah stood. And in the Holy of Holies was the space that represented the unity and the intimacy between God and the Jewish people. But what about within the soul of man? Within the soul of man, what creates the intimacy with God and the Jewish people is the da'at, is the knowledge. Ohel mo'ed, tent of meeting. Meeting happens through the da'at, through the knowledge. And the Tzemach Tzedek also adds in one more detail that in Hebrew, da'at is also the word for intimacy. Adam knew Eve. So here we have tent of meeting and knowledge and intimacy are all the same word, da'at. That's very interesting. And what we're saying here is the place of intimacy between God and the Jewish people within our soul happens when we study Torah. And specifically, there is the bed. What is the bed? The bed is where we are, the person, the people are unclothed, right? There's a law that one of the obligations of the man toward his wife is marital relations. That's the law. You can't say, well, we're just going to save on our rent. We'll live in the same home and I'll support you, but I'm not going to have intimacy. The one of the things the man has to provide for his wife is intimacy. Now, there's a very interesting Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, what happens if the guy says, well, I don't want to, during intimacy, I want to be clothed. And I want you to be clothed. Says the Mishnah, that's not acceptable. The law says Yotzivi Tank Tuba. You have to, if that's the case, that's grounds for divorce. Your wife can divorce you, and you would still have to pay her the ketubah. In other words, it's your fault. You destroyed the marriage because that is not the way of intimacy. The way of intimacy means there are no garments, and Kabbalistically, what that means is that there are places within our soul where we connect to God, but is a garment. Garment means it's indirectly. Our love to God our love to God is based on our understanding, and our understanding is how much can we understand of God. So it's almost like we love God because of the beautiful world He created. Well, you're not really seeing God. You're seeing God's garments, right? I love you because I love your dress. You're not really seeing the person. You're seeing their clothing. So what we say here, the bed is a place where you take off all the coverings, your own and of the person you love. And Kabbalistically, that refers to the place that's the holy of holies, but in the soul, that's the essence of the soul. The essence of the soul is where your essence connects with God's essence, not because you understand the greatness of God or you're emotionally drawn to God. That is garments. It's your garments and you're relating to God's garments. It's not the essence. The bed is the place of essence. That's the Kabbalistic interpretation of the equivalent of the bed in the relationship between God and the Jewish people. Now, what's also interesting about bed is the Hebrew word for mitah, which is bed, also comes from the word limata, which means down, drawing down. Mata is below. And maybe that's why a mitah is called a mitah, a bed, because you're lying down low, as opposed to when you stand erect, when you're awake. So metaphorically here, this is God descending into the world. And this is very interesting because in the previous verse 6, Mizot Olamin Hamidbar, who is the one coming up from the desert? We go up to God. God has to come down to us. The word bed means God is coming down. Not just because of the symbolism of the bed, also the word bed. Mita means lamata. So here we have this great gap between God. If we're going to meet, we have to go up and God has to come down. Again, like I said in the beginning, these verses are highlighting the differences between the two, the bride and the groom, which adds to the difficulty of this relationship. And in our relationship with the God, it's the same story. There are many obstacles. And the most greatest obstacle is the internal one. We're so different than God. We're physical, He's spiritual. We have to raise ourselves, and He has to come down, and we have to meet halfway. So that's the addition of the Hasidic commentary to the word mitah, to the word bed. Now let's look at the concept of milchama, the war of Torah. So we say the war of Torah, right? We said there were 60 men surrounding the tent of meeting. They're mighty. They're armed for the war of Torah. So the war of Torah, why is it called a war? So because when you debate, you argue, that's sort of opposition. You state something, the other person opposes. And in that sense, it's like warfare. And that's what Rashi said. What the Tzemach Tzedek does with the Hebrew here is he says something very interesting. He said the word milchama, the word for war, actually has another meaning. He's not the first person to say it, but he says this in this context. The word milchama, lacham, which is from milchama, battle. Lacham is to wage battle. Those exact letters are lechem, are bread. Okay? So melumde milchama, they are meant, skilled in warfare, could be they are skilled in bread. Okay? What does warfare have to do with bread? Well, we're always fighting over bread. No. What does warfare have to do with bread? There are different interpretations. One interpretation is that ever since God tells Adam that because of you, with the tree of knowledge, the earth will be cursed on your behalf, then the bread doesn't come naturally. Naturally, the earth gives forth weeds. If you want to grow bread, it's difficult. In other words, you have to do battle with nature to get bread and consume bread. So bread, it comes from the same word battle, because the only way to get bread is to do battle with the forces of nature, right? If you just put the seed down and you expect nature to produce bread, it's not going to happen. You have to go to war. You have to go to war against the elements. You have to go to war against the weeds, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the conventional interpretation of the relationship between the Hebrew word for bread and the Hebrew word for war. In this context, what the Tzemach Tzedek says, we're saying that battle is a metaphor for Torah because we debate. Yeah, true. But Torah is also connected to battle because we're going to throw in the word lechem, which is bread. Torah is our spiritual sustenance. So the Torah is our bread. That's one element. Another element is Torah is our bread, spiritual sustenance, but bread is also consumed in warfare. In other words, what's the connection between warfare and bread? So till now I said, well, to get bread from the ground takes effort. But the Tzemach Tzedek says that the connection between bread and warfare is because warfare is to consume. In biblical Hebrew, maybe in English too, but in biblical Hebrew, when the sword kills, the sword is consuming flesh. So the metaphor of taking something over and subjugating it to you is warfare. When we do eat bread, we're doing the same thing. We're taking over the vegetation and we're making it part of ourselves. We're elevating it to make it part of the human soul. So in other words, eating the bread is conquest. What is conquest? Conquest is not destruction. Conquest is you incorporate something outside of you into your kingdom. And when we eat, that's what we're doing. We're incorporating part of the outside world, the vegetable kingdom or the animal kingdom. But here we're talking about the vegetable kingdom, the grain, and we're making that part of ourselves. And in the broader sense, what the Tzemach Tzedek says is that when we go to war, when we study Torah, what we're doing is actually we're consuming the substance of the physical world and we're making it holy. So we're bringing something that is outside of us and we're consuming it, and consuming means you're taking it and you're adapting it to your own needs and making it an expansion of self. In this context, by the Torah, just like the sword destroys the enemy, the study of Torah has the characteristics of warfare because it creates that our animal soul and the negativity within ourselves and also the negativity within the world and within the subjects we're discussing, that becomes consumed within holiness. So in short, what the Tzemach Tzedek is doing here is saying that the word warfare is related to Torah. That's what Rashi said. To add a dimension, it's because it's not just that we're debating, but because just like warfare is consumption in biblical Hebrew, and therefore it's related to bread, so the Torah is also bread because we consume it and it becomes spiritual sustenance, but also the Torah consumes the negativity of the animal soul in the physical world. So this is a little bit more detailed than getting into the words. We did that with the mitah, with the bed. We added that the bed represents the descent because mitah comes from the word lamata. I just very much like that because you see the opposition. Verse 6, we are going up, right? Mizot olah. Who is this who ascends from the desert? And then it says here the bed of Solomon. But Tzemach Tzedek is saying bed is telling you coming down. God has to come down. And this issue of God having to come down to the wedding is going to be critical to understand what's the verse 11. What is the crown that his mother made for him? What does it mean that God needs a mother to make him a king? God has no mother. So we're going to have to deal with that next time. But in any case, this was enjoyable. I enjoyed this very much. I hope you enjoy this as well. Any comments, questions, jokes, opposition, anything else you want, please share. Go to war. Don't be afraid of warfare, intellectual warfare, that is. And otherwise, have a wonderful Shabbos. And don't forget that very soon, we're going to be emerging from the desert with pillars of smoke, with the bitterness and with the joy. That's what happens on Friday afternoon. So we have to get ready and to emerge from the desert.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Beautiful.